Welcome everyone here in person at the Evanston Public Library and I guess on Zoom. My name is Lori Howick. I'm one of the two co-facilitators of the Climate Issues in Action group of North Shore Village Network, which is one of the sponsors of this event today. I just wanted to make sure that kudos are paid to our eminent member and co-facilitator Irene Elkin, who has pretty much single-handedly put this together, having given birth to our speaker and a long time ago. And so she's now birthed this event, and I'm thrilled to introduce Linda Rockwell, the president of the North Shore Village Network, to finish our introductions for the day. Thank you so much. As a couple of, business things before I turn it over. At the back, there are some cookies and some pamphlets about North Shore Village, so please help yourself to both after the event. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. We are really excited to be here this afternoon. My name is Linda Rockwell, and I'm the president of North Shore Village Network. And we're excited about this very outstanding and timely program about the future of our world. We're going to learn the most recent information available. We welcome those of you who are here in person, who braved the icky weather, and also those of you who are joining us on Zoom. Staying warm and dry, but we're grateful to everyone for attending. So I just want to acknowledge we have three partners who helped this all come about. First of all, wanted to thank the Evanston Public Library, which is a frequent partner with North Shore Village Network in providing and co-hosting programs that are of interest to the larger community. And we're especially grateful to the library today for making virtual access possible for many of you who are at home attending virtually. I'd also like to ask, this is on behalf of the library, those of you who have questions after our speaker is concluded, to please put them in the chat section online. So please put them in the chat. Our second partner is the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan political organization with a rich 100-year history of voter and citizen education in Evanston. Members are men and women of every age, race, and background who believe that citizens are the key to effective government, and informed citizens are essential. Besides providing information about candidates and not endorsing them, the League studies many relevant issues, and after serious study and reaching member consensus on a position, they will take a stand on those issues. And if you'd like membership information about the League, please go to their website at lwve.org. Lastly, I suppose we consider ourselves the lead sponsor of this event, since, as Lori mentioned, our speaker was given birth to by one of our members. We're particularly delighted about this program actually for two reasons. One is that while we're a community-based nonprofit organization of older adults focused on maintaining independence and remaining contributing members to our community, and we provide supportive services and social activities and educational programs such as this one each year, we're also a community of friends who care about one another and share each other's challenges and celebrations. So the second reason why we're particularly happy about this program today and this particular speaker is because his proud mama, Irene Elkin, is over the moon to have him in town visiting, and we are very grateful that she was willing to share him with us. So thank you, Irene, who is here in person. If you'd like information about North Shore Village Network, you can go to our website, nsvnetwork.org, or for those of you here, brochures in the back of the room. So now I'd like to introduce the star of the program today. David Waskow is the director of the International Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute, which is a leading international think tank on environmental and developmental issues. His work is focused on international cooperation that catalyzes and supports action on climate change in developed and developing countries. David has testified before Congress on responses to climate change, and he's frequently a go-to source on these issues for the media. He did participate in the recent COP27 conference. So it's a special thrill for all of us, not just Irene, to hear what David has to tell us. So David, thank you so very much for making time to speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you to, hopefully I'll get all of these right, North Shore Village, Evanston Public Library, and the League of Women Voters for hosting this event. It's great to be here, and yeah, as you can imagine, this I think does serve as a hook to get me to Evanston now and again. So I'm going to talk about a lot of global politics and international politics having to do with climate change. But I did also want to note that I've been hearing a lot lately about what's happening in Evanston at the local level on these issues. And this really is, climate change really is an issue that needs to be tackled at all levels, global, national, local, with all kinds of actors involved, nonprofits, businesses, cities, et cetera, and citizens, of course. So it's great to be able to be here and connect up that local work that's being done here to the global. Let me start just by saying a few more words about the World Resources Institute, which you just heard a bit about. We are global in scope. We were founded about 40 years ago based in Washington, D.C., but we now also have offices around the world in China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and Brazil, several countries in Africa, and a couple of offices in Europe as well. So our purpose really is to, as you heard, address environmental and natural resource challenges with a real focus on people and development, how these challenges such as climate change intersect with the way that we need to address the needs of people, equity in the society, and other ways that society is sort of knit together, I think, in many ways with the climate challenge. We are described as a think tank, but we often like to say about ourselves that we're a do tank. We do rigorous research, we convene key stakeholders, and we do quite a bit of communications about these issues. So for us, it's not a matter of just producing a bunch of research that stays on the shelf, but really making sure that change happens in the world. So with that context about WRI, let me now shift into a bit about the most recent climate summit, UN Climate Summit, which took place in Egypt the first 2 weeks of November, so about a month or so ago. I'll begin actually with some context about what's happening in the world more broadly, and then I'll come back to the climate summit itself. So I think that it's fair to say that we are right now in what can be considered the best of times and the worst of times on climate change. Let me give you a snapshot of one of the reasons that it's the best of times. This is a chart that came out within the past week from the International Energy Agency. And what it shows is that, and what they have said is that their projections for the growth of renewable energy, both solar especially and wind, is that in the next 5 years, they're going to take off, that we will have greater growth in the next 5 years in renewables than we've had in the last 20 years altogether. As you see here, the yellow line is solar, the light blue line is wind. They are going to, together, the renewables will exceed the amount of power that we get from coal, It'll exceed the amount we get from natural gas and so forth. So what this means is that, and the IEA actually has been fairly conservative in their projections over the years, and in fact have under-projected what would be the growth of renewables. So what we're seeing here is projections from the IEA that suggest that we are going to see such a boom in renewables that they will overtake fossil fuels essentially in terms of the amount of energy that they will provide, electricity specifically. So we're making progress. We're definitely making progress. This past couple of years was a period when countries were meant to come forward with stronger actions, stronger targets. The Paris Agreement really laid the ground for this. In 2015, countries came forward with targets for 2030. What kind of emissions reductions they would aim for. And they were expected then 5 years later, and there was actually a delay because of COVID, 6 years later, really running up to the COP, which was COP26 last year, the climate summit that took place in Glasgow. They were expected to come back with stronger targets and actions. And so we did see quite a bit of that. The targets that were put forward by countries for 2030 cumulatively would reduce the emissions in 2030 from what had been the case in the previous round for Paris by 5.5 billion tons of carbon. Now, that's a substantial amount. It's essentially equivalent to the total emissions of the United States. So the increased action, the increased level of what we like to call in the business ambition for 2030 was quite substantial in many ways. The US emissions is not a small thing, not a small potato. However, this does not go far enough toward what we need to do in terms of reducing emissions by 2030 in order to stay below the critical temperature level that was outlined in the Paris Agreement, which is an increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. That 1.5 degrees is considered the point at which some of the impacts that we're seeing, once you go past that level, the impacts could start essentially cascading out of control, but there are also very specific impacts that the IPCC, the international body of science, the international body that is the scientific body essentially for the international community on climate change, says will occur. So for example, at 1.5 degrees, and this is already quite a significant consequence, about 70% of coral around the world will die off. At 2 degrees Celsius, that amount of die off among the corals will be 99%. So this is just one example. You can imagine how this plays out otherwise. So what we need to do on emissions reductions, particularly here by 2030, is to have cuts and targets that go 6 times deeper than what was put forward over the past couple of years. So 6 times more than that 5.5 billions of tons in reduced emissions that those targets reflect. And here you see on the right-hand side of this slide, a number of other metrics for the reductions that we need to see and the speed at which we need to undertake these sectoral transformations. I'll flip to the next slide, which gives us a sense of what's happening altogether in terms of what really needs to be done, which is that we need to transform sectors and systems in our society. This is not just a matter of setting emissions reductions targets, some number of tons of carbon or greenhouse gases that will be reduced, but it's really about changing the way that our societies and our economies work in dramatic ways, in fact. So what you see here is that in very few cases are we even close to being on track to changing those kind of systems? And this just gives you a sort of overview of how on track we are, none, off track, number of yellow exclamation points. These are ones that are headed in the right direction, but not fast enough. Well off track, quite a number, wrong direction. Going back to the previous slide, on the right-hand side here, you see what needs to happen to get us where we need to go. So for example, we need to phase out coal power 5 times faster globally, 6 times, sorry, faster than we currently are. We need to significantly reduce the rate of deforestation around the world. We need to increase the share of electric vehicles and so forth. And actually with zero carbon electricity, what essentially renewable energy gives us, we need to go 6 times faster. So you see that steep upward curve, but we need to be moving in many respects even faster than that reflects. So that's sort of some of the bad times. Let me give you more bad news, sorry. We are already in the era of climate change. I think, 20 or 30 years ago, one could say this is something that's coming in the future. We have to worry about this for the sake of grandchildren and so forth. We're past that point. And even honestly, if we reduced emissions to 0 today for a number of decades, we would still see rising temperatures. Now, it is the case that if you reduce emissions now, the benefits of that actually start to show up about 10 years from now. But nonetheless, because of the buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we will continue to see these rising temperatures. What we're trying to do is cut emissions dramatically so that we can reduce the speed at which the temperature is rising and be able to prepare for that. And also limit the damage that's going to be done further out into the future as well. So as I was saying, this is here and now. I'm sure a lot of you read about the floods in Pakistan several months ago, covering 1/3 of the country. We've seen fires on the West Coast of the United States. We've seen hurricanes at greater and greater strength. And often not only hitting parts of the United States like Florida, but also devastating islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere. The list goes on. There have been a number of both droughts and serious floods in Africa that I think haven't gotten much attention or been well reported. This is something that is not of the future, but something that we have to deal with concretely now. This is a graph from is showing UN humanitarian appeals over the course of the past 20 or so years. And as you can see, the number of events, of disaster events that required humanitarian assistance has increased dramatically when you look specifically at the events involving extreme weather. So that includes severe heat waves, severe drought, severe floods, severe storms. And there's some other causes potentially behind this increase of humanitarian need for these kind of events, these climate-related events, such as people living closer and closer to shorelines, more people on the shorelines, et cetera. But it's also very clear that this need is, in fact, a consequence also of climate change and the increasing temperatures and effects because of it that we're facing. So that's where the world is. Best of times, we really are seeing that significant progress. Renewables moving, electric vehicles moving very fast. I just saw that there's an expectation that the US will have an increase in electric vehicles in this coming year of 78%, so almost double what it is right now. So much to be thankful for, much to appreciate, but also much to be very sober about. I'll just very quickly, before I come to the COP and what happened there, I just wanted to set the sort of lay out some of the international context that we have right now. I'm sure you're aware of much of this, if not all of it. We right now have multiple risks linked to energy security, food security, and to some degree, the weakening of international climate cooperation. The US and China, for example, weren't talking to each other for about 6 months about climate change. We now are, once again. There's been a sort of resurgence of attention to military needs and prioritization, particularly with Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. And so what we have is a real need for greater global cooperation and solidarity at a time when it's missing in a lot of cases. We also need an accelerated energy transition. I think what we're seeing in Europe is that on one hand, they're having to shift because of the increasing price of natural gas, they're having to shift and sort of running their coal plants at higher capacity than they had, not dramatically higher, but somewhat higher. So that's not helpful, but they are also starting to build renewables at a much faster rate than they had planned up till now. And that's the kind of trajectory that we need to be on with renewables. And we also need, one of the things that the war in Ukraine has brought has been increased food prices and real food insecurity in many countries, particularly in North Africa, for example, and other parts of Africa where they import many of their staples. One of the things that this is really in many ways connected to climate change, or at least climate action that we need to take to make our food systems much more resilient to the climate impacts, lack of water, severe weather events, and so forth, but also to find ways to reduce emissions in our food system. And the more that we can make our food system sustainable, the more that it is likely that we will be able to handle these kind of food security moments, which I think are going to just continue to increase. I think, there's been studies done looking at what happens if you have multiple droughts in different geographies of the world at the same time. And food prices essentially spike in those scenarios, which I think we're now seeing a prelude to, if you will, or sort of a foreshadowing of. All right, so that wasn't very helpful or uplifting. But what I wanted to, the reason I wanted to lay this out is that this summit came in the midst of all of this, what some are calling the poly crisis. And I think that what we saw, it was not an easy negotiation process in Egypt, but what we saw, I think, was one of the few areas, and possibly the only one, on which governments have found a way, every government together have found a way to cooperate on a key international issue in the past several years. One would be hard pressed to point to something else. Even COVID did not, I think, get the same level of cooperation among countries. Now, this doesn't mean, like I said, it wasn't easy in the negotiations in Egypt, and it doesn't mean that the path forward is easy, but I do think that governments recognize to some degree that they can't work alone on these issues, but have to come together. So let me turn now to the COP. So a little bit of background on what a COP is. We just had COP27. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It is essentially the body that meets annually to carry forward the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That was the treaty that was agreed in 1992 originally. George H.W. Bush was president at the time. And it sort of has laid the international foundation for cooperation, global action on climate change over the past 30 years. So we have these, I won't get into why it's only COP27 and not COP30, but in any case, we have had these annual events for the past 27 years, and they do bring together a wide variety of countries, usually nearly every country on the globe, in fact, to negotiate, to discuss climate change and the kinds of action that the kinds of actions that need to be taken. The COP has sort of changed a little bit, or more than a little bit, perhaps, in recent years. because it's not only a negotiation setting, it's now become a sort of three-ring event. And in addition to the negotiations, we now have many businesses and cities and states and civil society organizations coming together at the COP to talk outside the negotiations about the kinds of actions that they're taking and the kinds of actions that we need going forward. So this has become not just a process to negotiate various kinds of texts, but also one that really is about how we carry forward the kinds of action on climate change that we need. And that's, I would just say from the COP in Egypt, it covered a huge range of issues: forests, power, transport, methane, just transition. You can go down the list. So a very important shift, I think, in what these events look like and what they do. This COP in particular, I think could be described as an impacts and implementation summit. So impacts, what do I mean by that? Last year in Glasgow, by the way, was COP26, was a major international moment. Many heads of state, well over 100 heads of state were there for a portion of the event. And it captured a lot of international attention. There were many commitments made by governments, by businesses, by cities, et cetera, about the action they would take. This COP, I think, was a bit lower profile and had a somewhat different agenda, partly because of the rhythms of the negotiation processes. So let me unpack a little bit about what impacts and implementation are here in this context. So impacts, climate impacts in particular, was a very central theme for this particular COP. And in fact, to a degree that I think hasn't been the case at any other COP in the past, really confronting directly what it means, particularly for vulnerable countries and communities, to be facing these kind of severe climate impacts. I'll get into a little bit more about how that played out in the negotiations, but I do think that this question of impacts was much more at the center of the stage. Cutting emissions, yes, very important, but at this COP in particular, very much an emphasis on what people are facing on the ground. And then implementation, we've had lots of commitments by governments, by others, as I mentioned. Now the question is how to go about undertaking those commitments, fulfilling those commitments. We still need stronger commitments. As I said, the targets for 2030 are not yet strong enough, but we also need to take serious action. So the gatherings of countries and businesses and subnational governments and all of that were a part of all of this mix in terms of actually carrying out many of the commitments that have been made. And to some degree, the negotiations, parts of the negotiations, as I'll get to, also address that kind of implementation side of things. So let's start with loss and damage. I don't know how many of you heard about the outcomes at the climate summit and the agreement to establish a fund on loss and damage. Okay, good number of you, great. So, and by the way, before I go on, let me say, first of all, thank you to everyone who's in the room, and also thank you to everybody who's gathered on Zoom. This is a fund. This was an agreement to establish a new fund that would address what's been called loss and damage in the negotiations. At points in the past, this has been discussed in terms of whether it was something involving liability and compensation. Would developed countries have to pay billions of dollars, for example, to developing countries because of the impacts that the developing countries are facing that they have not caused, that principally, historically, for the most part, developed countries have caused. So there was that liability and compensation issue that sort of lurked behind this for many years. I think it has become less and less of a question over time, not really what's at stake in discussing these issues of loss and damage. Instead, what it's been about now, and I should say actually, in the Paris Agreement, there is a reference to loss and damage, but there's also clarification in the agreement that went along with the sort of a separate decision going along with the Paris Agreement that says it can't be about liability and compensation, whatever happens in this process. So that, I think, has been set aside. So what are we talking about? We are talking about what happens when communities and countries face the consequences of climate change, when they face loss of homes, loss of livelihoods, loss of lives, and how we're going to address that. What are we going to do in terms of helping communities rebuild after climate-related disasters? What are we going to do about migration and refugees? What are we going to do about loss of food security and loss of water security? Declining water availability and water scarcity. What are we going to do about these things once they've actually hit? How are we going to respond? Now, let me say that clearly prevention is the best cure. So thinking out 20, 30 years from now, we need to make sure right now that, and I should say out to the end of the century and even beyond, we need to be thinking right now about how to cut emissions. So no question about that. We also need to be doing what's called adaptation or building resilience, preparing for these kind of events and making sure that communities are going to be as resilient as possible to them. So if there are floods, if there's sea level rise, how do you help communities be the best prepared they can be? Early warning systems are one example of that, that allow people to see, and Bangladesh has really pioneered this, that allow people to see what, find out when there is a looming disaster. So prevention upfront with emissions, some prevention with that adaptation and resilience thing, but we're not going to be able to stop some of these impacts from happening. And we're not going to be able to stop the harm that many of these communities in vulnerable countries will be faced with. And I should say, by the way, this is an issue in developed countries as well, in the United States and elsewhere. But for vulnerable countries with fewer resources, it's even more of a challenge. So a couple of kinds of prevention, but loss and damage is about when we can't adapt anymore and what the world is going to do. I'll give you a couple of examples of loss and damage. I think I lost this slide. Okay, they're in the wrong order, but there's economic loss and damage that's caused by things like hurricanes. In 2017, as it says here, more than $300 billion in damages. So that's one dimension to it. And you can think of a number of examples of economic loss and damage. And then there's non-economic. Sometimes this is, this is not really easily quantifiable, but also very critical. So losing burial grounds, for example, that are traditional for a community. Loss of sea ice in ways that undercut the cultural legacy of communities that are used to hunting in these areas, and so forth. So these are all the kinds of things that we have to grapple with. And what was done at COP27, as I said, was the establishment of a fund to address loss and damage. We have a lot of questions still to work through. For example, who's going to receive funds, who is going to contribute funds, and how much will be contributed in funds, and how will it be governed? How will this new fund be governed? So over the next year, there will be negotiations that try to work through those kind of questions. But what happened that was consequential was, for the first time, something that developing countries have been asking for 30 years, and particularly in the past decade, was taken seriously enough that we now have an agreement to establish this fund. And I think that alone is worth having a COP for. We have had lots of discussions about cutting emissions. Those will continue. We've had fair degree of discussion of resilience and adaptation. What we haven't had is this kind of global agreement, and we can talk a little bit about how that came about, and that was not an easy path, but we do now have this global agreement on a fund. And I think that was really the political centerpiece and the policy centerpiece really of this COP. Now, as I said, we still need to reduce emissions at COP27 in Egypt. I'd like to point to several things that were on the table and addressed to some degree or another. So the first was a real emphasis on maintaining 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 Fahrenheit. I always like to make sure in the US that we're aware of what that 1.5 actually means. To maintain a focus on that temperature goal as really the limit that the world is seeking to stay within. Now, this is not easy. As I showed you earlier, the level of systems transformation that we need is dramatic just in the next 8 years. And then beyond that as well. And so this is not an easy task, but for avoiding the very, very serious consequences, we're already gonna have serious consequences. We do need to have that kind of international consensus around keeping temperature increases below that level. So that was done. There were some countries that, China, for example, that the US government was nervous about not agreeing to that, but that was agreed in the end. A second thing which came out of almost nowhere, actually, but very important at this COP, was a serious debate about whether to agree that the world needs to phase down, or potentially also whether it would agree to phase out fossil fuels. Now, this whole question arose in part because last year at the COP in Glasgow, there was an agreement. It was a little bit fraught, and it was sort of one of those last minute dramas. There was agreement to phase down coal. Originally, it had been a language around phasing out coal. China and Egypt and some others objected, and it became phasing down coal. This year, India came with an interesting proposal, which was, well, we have phasing down coal. How about we phase down all fossil fuels over time? Some thought that this was a negotiating gambit on India's part, maybe, maybe not. But in any event, at the beginning of the second week of the COP, the European Union came on board this proposal. And from there, it caught fire. There were 80 countries, including the US, that supported the proposal, some of them calling for a phasing out, some for phasing down. But this was the first time that there has been an international discussion in a serious way, an international debate about actually saying, in order to protect our planet and the people on it, we need to be headed in a certain direction on fossil fuels. Now, everyone knows that that's true from the IPCC and other analysis that's out there, but having the world come together around that would be quite consequential, I think. Now, that wasn't agreed. There were countries, Saudi Arabia most notably, that did not accept that language, but it's not going away. It will reappear at the COP this coming year. This coming COP will be in the United Arab Emirates, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of attention to the oil and gas sector, and no doubt that this proposal will continue to be something that gains attention and I think support. And then the third thing I wanted to point to here is what's called just transition. This is the notion that as we go about taking climate action, particularly to reduce emissions, that we need to do it equitably, that we need to protect workers, for example, who are involved in producing coal or producing oil and gas. We need to protect workers and communities in other kinds of situations as well. And this has become a much broader, it began as what to do about coal workers and coal communities. How do we protect them as we go about reducing the use of coal? It's now broadened, this term has broadened to a number of other sectors and other types of people as well. Well, I mean, other sort of circumstances that people find themselves in. So this issue, this notion has grown in importance and it has become a real focus over the past, I would say, 5 to 10 years. There's a slight bit of language in the Paris Agreement that sort of implies it. But I think in the last several years, it's really taken off as a concept that we need to think about equity as we're taking climate action. These can't be separate. We can't think about our climate action on the one hand and not think about how it will affect people as we do it, and make sure that people are not inequitably hurt by the actions we take, and critically important, that the benefits also are widely spread. And I think actually the Inflation Reduction Act is a good example of how to tackle that. It has a number of provisions about making sure that renewables, for example, electric school buses, and so forth, are available to marginalized and disadvantaged communities. So it's the spreading of the benefits as well. Though this has been growing as a discourse and a set of issues, what happened in Egypt was that the decision that came out for the first time has a significant chunk of language about the just transition and a process going forward to start elaborating how the international community wants to address it. Now, I think in part, this is not just a process within the international negotiations. I think having it in the text is a reflection of how important this issue has become. So moving on, I also wanted to mention adaptation. That's the preventative work that needs to happen to help build the resilience so that people, communities are more able to withstand the kind of climate impacts that they're facing. There was a commitment last year at Glasgow at COP26 to double finance for this, for adaptation and building resilience. There aren't signs that significant strides have been taken by developed countries to double that finance. It would go from about 20 billion as of 2020 or so to 40 billion by 2025. But there are many questions about how far along we are on that path. And there was also attention, I think, that was important to the notion of locally led adaptation, that this has to be something that local communities are really the drivers of. So that's sort of where we are on adaptation. I think increasing awareness of it, but a lot to be done. And then climate finance. This is the notion that developing countries, particularly smaller and poorer ones, need support from developed countries to be able to take the climate action they need to. Now that includes both, or I guess it's a three-part, it's a troika, that includes being able to reduce emissions, deploy the renewable energy, the sustainable transport, sustainable agriculture that they want to in many, many cases, but don't necessarily have the resources for. It means providing the resources for them to take action on building that resilience and adapting to the climate impacts, and loss and damage now. Having the resources to deal with the after effects of disasters and what needs to be done. So that is a very central issue in the negotiations year after year. One of the questions now is whether, when really, developed countries will meet a target that was set actually initially 13 years ago, that by now, by 2020 actually, every year developed countries would mobilize $100 billion in resources. Now that's not just public money. It includes bilateral assistance, it includes the World Bank, but it also includes money that governments have deliberately tried to mobilize. Private sector money that governments have tried to mobilize. So looming questions about that. We didn't really see much headway on this question either at this COP, I must say. But where we did see headway, an important headway, had to do with international financial institutions and development banks like the World Bank, like the Asian Development Bank, and so forth. And this outcome in Egypt at COP27 was the first time that governments at a COP had said in the final decision that these institutions have to be reformed in order to better address climate change. This is also in the context of real rise in debt crises in many developing countries. And so the question is, how do we build a global financial system And how do these international financial institutions go about their business in such a way that they are in fact supporting developing countries on these multiple fronts. And so that is something I think we're going to see the question of what the World Bank is doing, what the IMF is doing, how well they're addressing climate as a rising issue on the agenda in the next couple of years. Watch for what happens with the next president of the World Bank. The current president, David Malpass, who has not been a friend to climate action, is termed out at the end of in spring of 2024, and the Biden administration will have to decide on who should replace him. Last thing I'll mention about the COP is that it really built, or needed to build, I would say, on COP26 last year. There were a huge number of exciting pledges then. Some on methane, some on forest loss, some on how to align the finance sector with our climate goals, some on phasing out coal that various private sector entities said they would, and financiers said that they would pursue. So a lot that was done there, but the question at this COP, and I think going forward, is how these are fulfilled, how they are carried out. Like I said earlier, this question of implementation is now quite critical. And so when you have financial institutions that have a combined total of assets of $130 trillion, say that they're going to put their assets to work, maybe not all 130 trillion, but they're going to put their assets to work for climate action. They're going to aim for net zero emissions in their portfolios by 2050. What does that mean? How are they taking action? How do we know that they're taking action, particularly when many of them still today are financing substantial amounts of fossil fuels? And I will just note that the alliance that of these finance institutions, private finance institutions that came together at Glasgow included not Fidelity, the one based in Philadelphia, Vanguard. Vanguard just announced within the last 2 days that it is pulling out of this alliance. It is no longer prepared to say that it will have a portfolio over time that will align with net zero emissions by 2050. So there are many financial institutions that are still in the game on this, but I think it shows that we really need to hold feet to the fire to make sure that commitments are followed through on. Just wanted to say one thing about next year. Next year, as I mentioned, is in the UAE and Dubai. And one thing in particular that I wanted to point to that is going to be a critical set of issues there, a critical process. It's something that the Paris Agreement invented called the global stocktake. This is essentially a process that's meant to look at where we stand on climate action. It includes not only cutting emissions, but also how do we deal with the impacts in various ways, and what does the finance look like. But not only looking at where we stand, but also where we need to go and what we need to do. And I've thought about it, that global stocktake sounds like it's very backwards looking in some ways, right? It's where are we now? What have we done up till now? I like to think of it as also the global springboard. What is it that we're going to do going forward? And it needs to be very politically relevant. It really needs to say, we need to move on fossil fuels. We need to move on transport. We need to move in many other areas. Hopefully some of that could be in the form of goals that the global community agrees to. But even if it doesn't, even if there aren't quantified targets, this is really an opportunity to set the direction of travel on this kind of transformational change that we need. I'm going to stop there. That may have been more than enough already in any case, and would be happy to take questions and comments and whatever you have to bring. For those of you online who may not be able to hear, we're looking to see what you might have put in the chat. And please do feel free, if you are online, to put questions in the chat, and I'll be happy to address those.
Okay. Question from Sarah J. Miller. Any thoughts on how emerging technology will support climate action?
So the question was how emerging technology will affect climate action. I'm not sure if that's referring to technologies in the energy sector and transport and agriculture, or whether it means that whether it's about high tech and sort of information technologies and how they will support it. But let me start with the first. I think that technologies are incredibly important to where we go. We've seen enormous progress in renewable energy technologies, particularly for solar, but also with wind. Windmills are now much, much larger than they were even 10 years ago. The blades are huge, well over, football field size now. And so we're seeing that, plus increases, strengthening of photovoltaic production with solar, just moving very fast. We've also seen fairly fast movement with battery power. I think we're going to see some other technologies start to emerge in important ways. And let me focus on food and agriculture just for a moment, because I think that actually is an arena in which over the next decade, we're going to see a lot of movement. So part of it is, Impossible Burgers. That will mean that people will not eat as much beef, which is one of the most climate destructive things that people do. And happy to go into why that's the case, but we'll have Impossible Burgers, but also the technologies are growing very, very rapidly right now to create meat that is grown in laboratory settings that tastes as good and has the same texture and all of that as the meat you can get from a cow. The other thing that I think will change in food and agriculture and again in livestock is that there's a real push right now around feed additives for livestock that will reduce the methane emissions they produce. And I think, methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It's in a 20-year time frame, it's 28 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Over a 100-year, 80-something times as powerful. In a 20-year time frame, over 100 years, it's only 20 times more powerful, but nonetheless very potent. And emissions from livestock actually are a quarter of all methane emissions around the globe. We often think of it as something that's coming from oil and gas pipelines, but in fact, this is a substantial challenge. And feed additives are something that can help reduce the methane emissions from livestock, particularly cows. And there's now significant research, not enough yet, I think, but we're moving in that direction around improving or developing feed additives that can help cut that methane emission. So I don't think technology is the silver bullet. There are many other things. We need to think about the social context in which we're doing all of this. How do we design our cities? How do we do just transition? What are our diets even, right? But technology can be an important part of the puzzle as we move forward. Now, hopefully that addressed the question that the person had, but happy to come back on the sort of information tech piece as well, if they're interested.
Does anyone have a question in here? Okay.
I was wondering, has anyone, did this conference examine a long proven technology, which is hardly a long-term solution, but is in the short term? The gasification of coal has been technically feasible for decades, but it's always been uneconomical. Was there any talk of reviving it or trying to lower the cost of it? And also, we're hearing more when there's opposition to wind farms that the turbines will suck in bats and birds, which unfortunately is true, but I wouldn't be surprised if the climate change deniers are behind that. What about just putting some kind of huge screen around the turbines, like a electric room fan, or some other means found by which the bats and birds would be deflected from that?
On the question about gasification of coal, I haven't seen anybody indicating any intent to try to develop that. I think one of the challenges is that it's very energy intensive itself. And so you don't actually get much, if anything, in terms of greenhouse gas reductions out of doing it. I think the technology that's coming on the energy side in terms of fuels is hydrogen. The development, the production of hydrogen using renewable energy through electrolysis. There's been a lot of talk about hydrogen in the last couple of years. I think it is going to move forward. The question is, what do we use it for? And I think we have to figure out the uses where it's absolutely critical for, and those where we need other technology. So for example, trucks could use hydrogen, but I think it's going to be, that would be a very expensive way to power trucks. We should use electricity to the degree that we can. Something though, like steel production may require that hydrogen. And so that's really, we should focus, because it's going to be hard and initially expensive to produce the hydrogen. We should really focus the hydrogen there. On the windmill question, there is a lot of technology development going on to try to make windmills something that birds avoid in very, so painting them in certain ways, other things that they're doing. So that is advancing steadily, and I think hopefully the rate of birds that are harmed by wind turbines will come down significantly. Yeah. Hold on one second for the mic.
This is very basic. I'm probably the only one in the room who doesn't know the answer, but for how long have these international conferences been going on? What's the time that we've been able to watch their progress? And how are people selected to be there? Who are the decision makers there?
Yeah. So on the first part of that, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is sort of the foundational agreement, was agreed in 1992. It went into effect in 1995. Before that, there were sort of other negotiations that preceded that agreement. And sort of there were proto-negotiations and then actual negotiations for that agreement that took place over the 4 or 5 years before 92. So that's in essence the span of time. We also had along the way the Kyoto Protocol, which came under that UN Framework Convention and was agreed in 1997. It's referred to as sort of a top-down agreement. It said for developed countries, here's how much each of them needs to reduce in their emissions by a certain date and in time. As you probably know, the US never was not a party to that agreement, signed it, and then George W. Bush unsigned the United States. That agreement was criticized by a fair number of folks for not including developing countries as part of it. And what that led to was a process really that culminated in the Paris Agreement of trying to come up with a framework that would allow commitments to be made both by developed and developing countries. Now, the way that Paris addressed it, and actually for those of you who followed all this, the Copenhagen outcome in 2009 was really a predecessor of this model, even though people said, oh, that it didn't work at that conference. But in fact, it laid the groundwork. And that model is essentially that countries will have what are called nationally determined contributions, not contributions in the sense of finance, but in the sense of what their emissions reductions are going to be. And so we've seen over the, since 2015, we've seen, or starting in 2015, we've seen countries come forward with these kind of targets, these self-defined targets. But The agreement also says some other important things. First of all, that every country has to come back every 5 years to strengthen what it's doing. And secondly, that there's a process of review. And, you know, in some cases that review mechanism isn't that stringent, but it does put a spotlight on countries and allows everyone to have a sense of what they're doing, how well they're doing it, whether they're going to meet their target or not. So those are that's sort of I think of it as a feedback loop, right? You have an international process, national governments comes back into the international process and around that way. In terms of who's there, first of all, the countries, there are 197 countries who are party to the EU that are party to the Paris Agreement now, in addition to the UN Framework Convention. And they're all able to have delegates there. In addition to their being sort of there on behalf of their individual country, there are a number of negotiating blocks within the negotiation process. So for example, the small island states have a block, least developed countries do. There are some regional blocks, particularly Latin America and Africa. And then you have some sort of blocks, sub-blocks of developed countries. There's something called the umbrella group that the United States is part of, that includes Canada, Japan, some others. And you have sort of ideological blocks as well. So there's a group of developing countries that call themselves the like-minded developing countries that tend to be sort of the, you know, they take a fairly strong position in terms of, you know, making sure that things are equitable among countries, right? So they'll push very hard on that question. China, India, Saudi Arabia are in it. So you can see there might also be some other factors underlying their position. So that's the negotiations in terms of countries. In addition, there are lots of observers. So I attend as an observer. There are non-governmental organizations that get accredited to this process and are able to send, they tell us our quota every year, are able to send representatives. And so that has grown significantly. There are quite a number of folks. Now we can sit in and observe the negotiations, at least up till the final few days when it gets, you know, put under wraps, and, you know, you can't go into the rooms where the ministers are meeting. But otherwise, you know, we're able to see a lot of what's happening in the negotiations and talk to negotiators, try to influence negotiators and so forth. So there's a team, there's sort of two teams, right, or there have been. So one team sits under John Kerry, who's the special presidential envoy for climate. And then there's also a State Department team that works in tandem. That's sort of a standing team working on climate negotiations. So they're the principal representatives, although this year and last year, the Biden administration also sent a number of cabinet members, not to negotiate, but to talk about what their departments are doing on climate. So energy, transport, and so forth. The other question, remind me, what that was the second question, right? Yeah.
I'm gonna ask one of the virtual questions, and then we'll do some more in-person questions. Last year after Waskow, some young people returned expressing frustration, felt they weren't heard, weren't recognized as participants in the effort. What is your impression this year? Did young people have a role?
I thought this year there was less of a sort of organized youth presence in a very forceful way. There were youth there and youth organizations were there. But it wasn't to the same degree as last year. Greta Thunberg, for example, didn't come. I think that the access, I mean, the challenge is that the access is complicated, and you know, it's one thing to know you can walk into a negotiating room. It's another thing to understand what the heck they're talking about in that negotiating room. And so I think that it was kind of impenetrable, even when youth could access what was happening. It was sort of an impenetrable process. And we and others have done a fair amount over the years to try to train and, assist youth in understandings or what the actual policy issues at stake were. There were other issues at Glasgow. They shut down, and when the heads of state were there, they shut down a whole portion of the venue. This year, they were smart enough not to do it quite that way. I think that, going forward, there's a challenge, a sort of general challenge around how civil society gets to engage in these processes. And for example, the global stocktake that I mentioned is a process that so far has actually allowed non-governmental organizations and cities and others to sit at tables with national governments to talk about where things stand, where we need to go, what we need to do. So these kind of models, I think, are starting to evolve, and hopefully that's where we'll head over time.
So my question is related. I'm interested in at COP if there's a psychology or social behavioral contingent. I'm really curious about how you get people's behavior to change, how you get communities' behavior to change and nations' behavior to change. So that's the one psychological issue that I'm concerned about that I think really needs addressing. And the second one is, as a psychologist with clients who have great anxiety over climate change, and it almost renders people paralyzed to do anything. And it seems to me we need some psychological interventions to help people manage these overwhelming concerns and fears.
Yeah. So on the behavior question, I think that is a critical question going forward. How do we, particularly given the kind of transformation and degree of transformation that we need? And there's work now being done on sort of more on the individual level, as you were pointing to. So for example, there's a team at WRI that's looking at how you get people to want to buy EVs more than otherwise, or to shift their diets more than otherwise. It turns out, for example, in cafeterias, that if you have vegetarian food and you simply shift where it is in the line and you don't label it as vegetarian, people will eat much more of it. So there's that micro level, but I do think we also need to have the broader communal level and beyond. One of the things on the communal level that I've heard about that I think would be interesting to try to really spread is sort of pods of people who could get together and talk about what they're doing to prevent climate change, whether it's political or in their personal lives, and then sort of challenge each other to do more. And this actually turns out, I mean, there's been enough studying done in the last couple of years to show that this is actually pretty effective. So I think we do need to, although I'm all for political change, I don't think this is something that, people should feel as their individual responsibility at a fundamental level, right? Because we do need that broader change. But I do think getting people together can both galvanize individuals' actions, families' actions, communities' actions, but also have an impact politically. So those are two. In terms of the political realm and government's behaviors, I mean, honestly, at a basic level, I think that it has to do with political power and influence. And that's a tricky thing to modify, I guess, over time. But I think, for example, the Sunrise Movement, the 20-something youth movement that arose about 4 years ago, had an enormous impact, and even one event that they did where they sat in outside of Nancy Pelosi's office really triggered an enormous wave of youth action and engagement politically. And I think, I don't think that Joe Biden and his campaign or the Democratic Party even writ large would have emphasized climate change in 2000 had it not been for what the Sunrise Movement did in the 2 years leading up to that. So anyway, that's hopefully some answer on that. In terms of the anxiety, I do think this is also a real challenge. And I mean, as you can imagine, among those of us who do this professionally, it can sometimes seem pretty bleak. I think one of the most important, well, two things. One is, I think it's really important to recognize that 1.5 degrees, which I talked a lot about, or even 2 degrees, which a while ago used to be the threshold that people talked about. So 3.6 Fahrenheit. That's not an on and off switch. It's not like when you're at 1.49 degrees, it's one way, and at 1.51 degrees, it's going to be a totally different way. This is something that gets worse and worse and worse depending on what we do about it, right? And so I prefer to think of it in terms of, really fighting for every 10th of a degree. That the consequences will get worse as the temperature rises. There are also feedback loops, right? You have forests drying out, no longer able to absorb carbon, and many other examples like that, right? So what we need to do is to keep, and as things get worse, they will get worse, right? So we need to just keep, working. And I think there's also a degree of hope. The second thing is just, in the face of, oppression over history, the most important thing I think has often been people having hope that there was in fact a path to address what they're facing. And I just read somewhere that there was a study done looking at sailor drownings, and they determined, now how they determined this, given that some of the people drowned, I'm not sure, but in any case, they said that the most important factor in whether somebody drowned or not was their level of hope. Now, maybe that's a little made up, I don't know, but in any case, I think even if it's metaphorical, I think it does speak to what we need to do. So it's recognizing that we need to fight for every inch and having hope.
I'm going to ask,
I'm happy to continue on that front, but there's other questions.
is it okay if I ask one more virtual audience, or quite a few coming in, and then we'll do a in-person question. The question is, can you please talk about why there isn't more mention about the role of public transportation, trains, subways, buses in the discussion about cutting emissions?
Good question. So, the transport emissions discourse has become very focused on electric vehicles. I think that is really, really important. We need to shift, there's no question, to electric vehicles. However, given the number of the expected growth in vehicles worldwide, particularly in developing countries over coming years, simply electrifying our entire fleet of cars, passenger cars, is not going to cut it. It also means that, take an electrified SUV, for example, we would still be spending, enormous resources, material resources, right? Steel, plastic, et cetera, all of which requires a lot of carbon emissions for those electrified EVs. So I don't think we can get there with EVs alone. And so the question of public transport, biking, even how cities are designed for pedestrians, all of these kind of things, I think, are going to have to be very fundamental to what we do. WRI and others have a sort of a model for transport called avoid, shift, improve. Avoid is, not having to go somewhere, essentially, or making, in other words, having cities and suburbs designed so that people don't, in fact, have to travel long distances. Shift is to shift from passenger car models, for example, to public transport. And then improve is electrification of vehicles, when that is still what people use.
David, I just wanted to thank you for your answer about the psychological supports, because one of the things that we at the CIA try to do is help each other stay on the path as older people of being conserving and caring about the environment and living a life that reflects that. The other part we're very concerned about is how can we help the younger generations? How can we be active intergenerationally? Because we kind of made the mess, but the kids are going to have to deal with it and clean it up. So if you could just give some hints from, I guess, a few more hints about intergenerational stuff, but thanks for stressing our support of CIA.
That's something we're planning in CIA with the young people. Can I just do that on top of that? Right. A number of young people in the area, including some from Evanston, went to COP27. There had also been a bunch at COP26. And we had one on our program last year when David spoke. And what we're trying to do now is plan a program for the winter where we have a number of those students, and Rachel Rosner, who was president of Citizens Greener Evanston, who was their chaperone, will be there, and trying to find out how they think we can help them in their efforts, because they're right on the front lines as much as they can be, and they know it's their future. And so we are, as our committee, is trying to help move that along.
So I think building bridges in a variety of ways is going to be absolutely critical. I think also thinking about this sort of pod model of climate action could be something that could be done intergenerationally. So I do think, you know, it's extraordinarily important, and we need to think about some of the other ways in which we need to build bridges across different kinds of communities, people in the various parts of their lives and so forth.
There are quite a few more virtual questions. I know we're running out of time. I'm going to ask one more. Why does it seem that no players seem to be worried about world population growth?
Forgive me that I don't have the exact statistics right at hand. However, yeah, correct. So when you look at where emissions are coming from and where population growth is greatest, those are completely different places. They have nothing to do with one another. And even where emissions growth is greatest and where population growth is greatest have nothing to do with each other, basically. So I think we have to think about, you know, population issues in a totally different way. I think the key thing is that, honestly, we need to make sure that women and girls have access to family planning, and that has benefits in and of itself, obviously. And what we've seen also is that when women and girls do have that access, that their economic status increases. And so things like, how do you deal with a flood? How do you deal with a drought? Women become more able to address those kind of challenges. But that's a whole separate question from the emissions one, right? And just to give a flavor in terms of emissions, so in the United States, we produce around 18 tons per capita of greenhouse gas emissions in a year. In Europe, it's about 8 tons, 7 to 8 tons. It's dropping, so 7 to 8. China has been rising. It's now 7 to 8 tons per capita. But there are many countries around the world where it is considerably lower. India, in fact, is 2 tons a person. Many parts of Africa are below even 1 ton. And I think on average, Africa is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 tons a person. So it's just, I think that the question of emissions is just a very different one from the question of population.
Is there another question in the room? Okay, I will keep going on here. What do you see as the effect that the Vanguard funds withdrawing from the net zero effort and finance will have? It's a very specific question.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, that's an important question. I think what's going to be most important is making sure that those who are still in it, so the Black Rocks and others, actually keep moving forward and take seriously the net zero commitment that they've made. So I don't know that, you know, one could, you know, make Vanguard do a U-turn again, but to go in the right direction. But I do think that we need to make sure that those who are still in really do move forward.
Another question is, has the World Resources Institute taken a position on a carbon tax? Is it involved with methods of carbon dioxide removal?
What was the last piece?
Is it involved with methods of carbon
Oh,
dioxide?
carbon removal. Okay.
Yeah.
We do think, given lots of modeling that we and others have done, that carbon pricing, which can be done in various ways, carbon taxes, right now, the best example, that carbon pricing is an important policy tool. It can reduce emissions, particularly in the electricity sector, perhaps in industrial sectors as well. However, it can't be the only tool. And for instance, with transport, carbon pricing is really not going to cut it in terms of what we need to see happen. We need to have stricter emission standards, and we need to move quickly on electrification of vehicles and public transport and other modes of local transport. That is not going to be particularly effective. If you think about the increments of, you know, we see gas prices going up and down. People don't drive that much more or that much less. They complain about the price. They're unhappy about the price. It means that they don't have money for other things that they probably do need money for, but they don't stop driving. So carbon pricing is not going to be a tool, an effective tool in that kind of context. So it's really, you have to have a basket of policy tools at hand to be able to tackle these things. Now, carbon dioxide removal, WRI's take is that when you look at all the modeling, it's very clear, emissions reductions, that's the #1 agenda. We have to do that across the board, across multiple sectors. However, even so, even if we do really well on emissions reductions, we will still need to suck some carbon out of the atmosphere in order to keep temperature change below 1.5 certainly, or limited to 1.5. Now, there's a possibility of sort of going up a little bit above, that's called an overshoot, a little bit above 1.5 and then coming back down if you suck enough carbon out of the atmosphere. But either way, either staying below it or coming back down, you likely will need a good amount of carbon dioxide removal. But again, it's small in relation to the emissions reductions we need, right? So the proportion is small. It's technologically still challenging. The cost is still challenging. Now, carbon pricing could help in terms of incentivizing action on it. I don't think, you know, Europe has a pretty good carbon pricing regime right now, and I don't think we've really seen a dramatic surge in the deployment of carbon dioxide removal technologies. But we know it can be done. There are places in the US, there are places in Europe that are doing it with technology that sucks the carbon out, puts it underground, and so forth. So we need to figure out how to do this, how to do it better, but it shouldn't overshadow at all what we need to do to reduce emissions as the first and most important, and probably, you know, first, second, third, fourth on the list of things that we need to do. The other thing I wanted to note is carbon dioxide removal also can be done not just through technology, but through trees, right? And we need to protect our trees. Stopping deforestation is probably the most critical task. Reforestation and forestation in places where we haven't is also important, but that has to be done right. And there's a lot of evidence about planting trees in the right way and planting trees in the wrong way, and you can really screw it up. You know, even when it's being done at a very large scale, things like plantation approaches to growing new trees just tend to not do what we need done on this.
Okay, there are a couple more in-person questions. I want to ask this one. I'm going to ask one more virtual question, and then hopefully the other two are quick because we are running out of time. But the question is kind of how
I
is
can
it?
keep going.
How is the implementation happening? Like, are there specific working groups that will implement the COP decisions between this conference and the next one? Or are they international teams, or does the COP depend on individual nations to continue the work between the conferences?
So the answer is yes. So there are various kinds of work programs that are put together out of the negotiations. So for example, I mentioned just transition. And so there's now a work program that's being put together to develop approaches and ways of going about it. They'll also bring a proposed decision to the next COP. And the idea is, and there are a number of issues on which these work programs exist. So that's an international process that's meant to push it forward. But, you know, at the end of the day, it also depends on countries themselves taking action and doing it on the ground. So an international process that can be catalytic, I think that's the best way in some ways to think about the international process, but then people have to do it on the ground.
You mentioned real early on about COVID. I'm really hoping that we learned globally something about how do you manage a pandemic. If we couldn't even manage a life or death immediate issue like the pandemic, I'm not very hopeful that we're going to be able to manage this long-term stuff that you're talking about. Are we learning from the pandemic and how the world took hold of that and looking at that data?
I don't think so, not yet. I do think that the pandemic has been a major challenge in terms of international coordination, cooperation, solidarity, all of that. And I think we are going to have to learn about what the flaws were and how that was done if we're going to be able to ultimately tackle a challenge as big as climate change. As I said, I do think that this past COP showed that countries actually do want to come together around climate. I think that there's such a broad recognition of the threat that it poses that countries, although they often are, fractured in various ways, and geopolitical questions can come into play. I think countries nonetheless do want to find ways to cooperate on this front. And the question is, can we get it moving deep enough and fast enough?
This will be the final question, and I'm going to say thank you so much before I ask it and invite people again to come back and maybe mingle a bit and have a cookie and hopefully keep you a little bit longer. But I'm concerned about how much carbon we're going to be spending to build out all the infrastructure we need to support the electrification process. For example, in my own place where I live, we're looking to put in some charging stations, but it involves more electricity, which has to be generated somewhere. We're going to build different kinds of infrastructure for supporting vehicles across the country, and just beyond our own, every part of the transportation system we're talking about changing. And so will there be a bump at the beginning of all this that will take us over and then add to the burden with maybe a good payout at some point in the future, I guess?
So, yeah, in addition to that, there's been a buzz coming from some sort of climate denier corners lately about, the amount of minerals that will be needed and the extraction processes and so forth. And I think it's important to look at these things holistically, right? And so if you look holistically at what's needed, both in terms of resources and the emissions that will come from building the stuff, EVs, just to take that example, are still going to be better than internal combustion engine cars. And looking at the impacts that the oil industry has had and continues to have in communities around the world, I think that there's no question that that has been quite severe. And although we have to guard against that kind of thing happening in critical minerals, that degree of destruction of environment, local environment and communities and so forth has not yet emerged. Now we do have to, attend to it, right? And we can't wish away trade-offs. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think efficiency in the broadest sense, but really reduced energy consumption, reduced consumption of manufactured products, right? Which include wood products, steel products, plastic products, right? I think all of that is going to be critical. And, in the transport sector, that goes to this question we were discussing earlier about public transport, walking, biking, et cetera, right? I mean, that's really going to be essential to this. Now, I don't think we have passed a threshold of there being sort of a sense of a movement for efficiency or, reduced consumption of transport, passenger car transport or other things. There's sort of this degrowth movement in Europe. But I don't think, certainly in the United States, I don't think that's going to be the narrative that works. But I do think we are going to have to tackle some of these questions. You need a mic. You need a mic. No.
Okay. I wanted to thank David. As some people know, it did give me an opportunity to see my son. But it's also an opportunity for all of us to learn a whole lot. And that's happened this is the 4th year in a row that North Shore Village has had David come and tell us what happens at the international meetings. And I don't know if there's a better source of information that we could possibly get. So thank you again, David. And thank everybody for coming. This was wonderful, wonderful questions. Can you hear me? Lori's telling me you can't hear me. Is that right? What? Maybe I need to take off the mask to use the mic. How's that? But what I wanted, in addition to thanking David, and I think you heard that, I also want to thank everybody who came out on a rainy day to be here, and also the people who are on Zoom. So thank you, everybody. And we'll have another one next year. I don't think we're going to get past the point where we're going to need one.
Oh, and thank all of you. Oops, we're offline. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.